Greetings everyone and welcome back to 365 Days of Prog. Today we're going to be reviewing Danger Money by the band UK.
Hi, my name's Naomi. I'm an avid progressive rock fan, but I'm a long ways from knowing all the prog albums out there. But this year, I'm gonna give it a try. This is 365 Days of Prog.
So this review is going to be a little different from how I do reviews normally, but I'm gonna elaborate about this in just a second. Firstly, let's hear some of my favorite bits from this album. So as I said, today's review is going to be performed in a different manner than I usually do. So usually what I do is I tell you the entire overview about the band and the album, and then we're gonna talk about what I think of it. But today what I'm gonna do is I'm only gonna tell you half of the story. Now specifically, what story am I referring to? I'm referring to the story of UK and Danger Money, and the story I'm gonna tell you today will begin in the making of this album and what came afterwards in the future. But everything that has to do with the formation of the band, their debut self-titled album, everything like that, I'm not gonna talk about it in this one. And why am I choosing to do so? Well, it so happens that the episode in which I'll be discussing their self-titled debut album is coming up in only 3 days, which means there's only a 2 unrelated album gap in between this one and their first album, which make up their entire discography. Now, just to give you some proportions to all of this, the chances of these 2 albums coming this close into the list while also being randomized in the first place is a chance of 1 in 183, which gives us around about a chance of 0.54% chance. And by the way, if you want to know how I did all this math, I did it using the help of these amazing guys over on Reddit, so thank you so much to all of them. So let's begin with the overview. So after releasing their debut album in 1978, the band UK began to tour around Europe and the United States as a quartet. And after finalizing that tour, the band began thinking about their second album, and guitarist Alan Holdsworth wanted the direction of the next album to be more improvisational. But Eddie Jobson and John Wheathan both disagreed about this continuation of the band's sound, so in accordance with that, Holdsworth just packed up his things and departed the band. And Bill Bruford, back then who was on the drums and percussions of UK, was also pretty much a bro and also packed up his things and went. But being undeterred, the band brought forth Terry Bonzio, who played with Frank Zappa in the past, to replace the role of Bill Bruford on drums and percussions, and these guys were not able to procure the use of any guitarist, so with the ever-increasing pressure on creating a second album, these guys just went ahead and became a trio. So in 1979, the band wrote, composed and recorded their second album called Danger Money, which is the album we're reviewing today. And in some sort of a cruel act of karma, after finishing up touring, mostly opening for Jethro Tull, the band would think about creating a third album, but unfortunately Wheaton and Jobson would get into artistic differences, which was of course the thing that led Alan Holdsworth to leave the band in the first place, and these disagreements would go ahead and cause the band to break up and cease to exist. So after pretty much a 2, maybe 3 years run, the band would not exist. Each and every member would go ahead and join their own respective band of their own, and that's where the story stood for a while. Now looking into the future, there are certain moments which we can pinpoint in the legacy of UK. Firstly, Eddie Johnson wanted to try and make a reunion form somewhere around 1995, which although gaining some speed never really materialized. And another thing that happened is that in 2007, a band called UKC containing some of the original members was formed, and alongside other different artists, these guys played some King Crimson and UK gigs, as well as of course their own original material. But despite sounding very much like the original name, these guys were a separate group which were definitely unrelated to UK and not supposed to be one of its reincarnations. But when looking of the real legacy of UK, we can really only pinpoint their 2 albums. Of course, their self-titled debut, which I'll be talking about in just 3 days, and their second album called Danger Money, which we're reviewing today, which also happened to be a really good album, which I really love. Now, from the utmost objective point of view that I can ever give you, I can tell you all that I really didn't know a lot about this album, but that didn't mean that I didn't know a lot about UK before getting into this one. You see, their first album, their debut, is a heavily popularized album. Everyone that knows a bit more about prog than just the basics knows about this album, but it doesn't seem like a lot of people know about their second, and looking at ratings of it over on Spotify, it definitely doesn't hold the same weight as the first one. So when I thought about getting into this one, listening to it, I was kind of expecting it to be, you know, the younger brother, the lesser impressive, the one that everyone just forgets about. And I was very much surprised, to the point where I do think that this one probably was the biggest surprise so far that I've had on the list from an album, which I thought to be, you know, going to be very bad and turning out to be very good. So much like the debut album, the name of the game here has to be the Yamaha Cs80. Now you're probably asking yourself, what is the Yamaha Cs80? And well, for those of you who are unaware, Yamaha also, with many other things, they manufacture keyboards, and back in the day they would manufacture some really interesting analog synthesizers, and this was one that came out in 1977, which was quickly acquired by Eddie Jobson, and he took it with him to the UK recordings and basically make their sound much more memorable because of its unique and very distinct timbre. Now, of course, a synthesizer can sound in many different ways, and that's the entire point of it, but the thing is that every single note produced by this one particularly is very much iconic for it and makes this entire album very much iconic as well. And you know, if I'm to be concerned, despite the fact that today's technology and computers can basically allow us to synthesize any sort of instrument, I don't feel like I've ever heard anything like this one. So even 4 decades later, this sound on this album by the Yamaha Cs80 still sounds very much original and unique for its own. So take for example instances like the main riff on the title track, or Rendezvous 602, which has a very beautiful and haunting sound of the Yamaha on there, which make it so much more memorable. And of course, a lot of it has to do with Jobson's playing as well, but I do believe that the timbre of this specific synthesizer does do a lot lot of the job. And you know, I always love it when there's bands with some very signature sounds to them, especially when it comes down to the keyboards, much like Cressida with their Hammond organ, or Sven Grunberg with all of his various analog keyboards that were designed just for him. I always like listening to stuff like that, and that's why I'm also really anticipating listening to the Yamaha in action when I get to their debut album. But I don't believe that the Yamaha Cs80 is the only reason for this album being so good, and I think there's another reason which is also quite prominent on here. Seeing as this album came out in 1979, we must remember that prog was on a steep decline by this point, and other types of music, popular music, synthesized, pop synth music, or even punk or funk were getting really popular in this time. Prog was basically becoming irrelevant, and unlike many other bands which succeeded in the early 70s and tried to find their sound in the 80s and lost a lot of their originality, I do believe like UK on here is treading a very fine line between still staying, somewhat consistent with the past progressiveness, but also trying to keep up with the times. And this constant attempt of embracing the new and sticking to the old is why I do believe that this album is so good as well. I personally love contemporary music as much as I like prog, although I do believe that it's most consistently that I like progressive acts rather than contemporary and mainstream songs, but honestly I can love them both and even sometimes equally. So when I listened to this album and I saw the way that the two just homogenized with one another in one place, I couldn't help but just fall in love with what I heard. I can sort of see why the ambiguity of this album would cause many people to not like it and see it as something bad, but I don't know, after I think I've listened to this one 3 times by now, and I only listened to it the first time yesterday, so I've been really going hard at this one. I really love what it has to offer. It's such a good album, such a distinct album, such a fun album to listen to, and it's very much unique in every single sense. And while at first I might have thought this one to be just yet another King Crimson spin-off group that's maybe just gotten a bit more popular than the rest, I can definitely say that that's not the case. There are some King Crimson influences on here, and that's fine, that's just good, but they've built their own identity on here, and despite the fact that 2 of their original members have departed and was basically replaced, I still do find this album to be a very much realized album that serves a great purpose. So all in all, I don't think that there are any songs on this album that are less than great, and some of them are definitely even perfect in my opinion, and thus I really love this one, and I can only hope that the debut will also be as good. So for anyone here who happened to watch Lost back in the day, you might remember that there's this scene, and no, I'm not gonna do any spoilers if you haven't watched the show that is already on air for 20 years right now, just joking of course, but there's this scene in the series where a character called Jin is basically coming back from work. He's very stressed out and he's going to the sink in the bathroom and he's washing his hands from blood, and that doesn't really look good. And I'm not going to say any more because I don't want to spoil anything, but basically that scene is very much reminiscent in this album's cover as well. Of course, none of them were inspired by any other, at least I don't believe that the creators of Lost really inspired that scene from seeing this cover, but I really like the idea behind it. I also love the fact that the name of this album is called Danger Money, and despite not seeing any real danger or any money on here, we do get the association between the two. There is a cause and there's an effect. One thing is connected to another in certain ways. It seems like someone has just committed some sort of crime for some amount of money, and they're basically washing their hands from the wrongdoing that they did. And while I do believe that this cover is a really interesting cover that I can basically dwell into even further, I don't believe that it has any connection to the music itself, at least not to anything other than the title track itself. And seeing as this album really isn't conceptual and it doesn't have any narrative going for it, and they didn't even try to do so, I kind of get that this album cover is supposed to represent a bigger idea that doesn't really have a lot to do with the music directly. So this album, it's almost perfect. They took the danger on here and they got the money, and thus they will be receiving a rating of 9 out of 10. But that's about it guys. I hope that you enjoyed this video, and stay tuned for tomorrow because we're going to be listening to Clutching at Straws straws by Marillion. I of course want to thank my lovely supporters over on Patreon, so thank you so much to Clay, Wanham, Wrist of Kings, and Lindsay Haycox. You guys are just the best, and if any of you want to support me over on Patreon, you can find the link down in the description or in my about page. But that's about it, guys. Have a wonderful day, and I'll catch you all tomorrow. Bye, guys.